So this is a bit of a story with four constituents. The first constituent is my son Matthew, who you're going to meet tonight, who's the courageous one and who's battled bipolar for over 5 years and has just made enormous progress and is in such a good state right now that we're so proud of him. The second constituent, who I'm going to introduce shortly, is my wife, Jan, Ellison Baszucki, who is the tenacious one and the creative one and the one who for years and years researched on her own, tapped into many of your networks, and ultimately brought us to where we are today in metabolic health, metabolic psychiatry, and a huge cure for my son. The third component is me. CEO of Roblox, have learned a little about innovation and have fortuitously in the last year gone public. So we have this wonderful opportunity, and I sometimes think of it as a philanthropic greenfield because this is a huge opportunity. And it's very hard in philanthropy to find one big area to deploy the fruits of one's labor, if you will. And this is exciting to me because it's potentially something like that. And then it's a story of all of you, innovators, visionaries. I'm familiar with it, what it's like to be an innovator and a visionary. Sometimes it's scary, it's very hard. We're working on problems that are really big, that are not short-term tactical solutions, but giant strategic solutions. And if they work, you get that funny feeling in your stomach that this might be 10 times bigger than we think. It might not work out, but it might be 10 times bigger than we think. And that's the excitement about taking the long view and solving hard problems and doing innovation. So we have four wonderful constituents that'll be here tonight. And with that, I'm happy to introduce my wife, Jan Ellison Baszucki. Welcome.
He has a lot more practice at speaking than I do. So I'm going to stand behind the podium. Thank you all for being here. When we hatched this plan, it wasn't that long ago, a few months ago, I said to Kara, but it's not that much notice. Is anyone going to come? And she said, they're going to come and look, like you all came. This is incredible. So, wow, thank you. And then I started to have some imposter syndrome, and I was like, I have to stand up and talk to people who've dedicated their lives to medicine and neuroscience and psychiatry and entrepreneurship, and what is my qualification for standing here? So I did what one does in those moments. I called my therapist, and she reminded me that I have this one very important qualification, which I share with my husband, which is that we traveled with Matt on his mental illness journey, and we watched him go into it, and we watched him come out the other side, and watching him come out the other side and having some idea of why that was, of the interventions that made his recovery possible, enables me to stand here today and have something to offer you all, which is really his story. So I'll share a bit about that story. It started on March 13, 2016 at 3:30 p.m. when he sent me a text. He was a freshman at UC Berkeley. He's the eldest of our 4 children. We also have 3 daughters. So he'd gone off to college that fall. We had known he was not doing well, but we didn't know the extent of it until I got this text. Going through a profound enlightenment, can't think straight. I know these texts seem weird because they are coming straight from my body. And then I knew that something was very terribly wrong because this was a kid who, when he was in 3rd grade, said, I'm a boy who goes to church, but I don't believe in God. He was a rationalist. He was, not into spiritual things, and suddenly something had changed in his brain. And that began our journey, what Pete Early, who wrote a book about his own son's journey in bipolar disorder, calls a journey through America's mental health madness. And that became the day that we were the family that people needed to bring casseroles to, but of course nobody brought casseroles because you don't talk about a bipolar diagnosis He spent 10 days in the psychiatric hospital at Stanford. He was 5150'd. He was released on 20 milligrams of Zyprexa, which is a second-generation antipsychotic, and a diagnosis of bipolar 1 with psychotic features. And that, it was supposed to be a manic episode. We knew it was a manic episode right when we got that text. I basically Googled his symptoms, and I could tell that what was happening. And the bipolar 1 diagnosis, we accepted, but his psychiatrist, who was a Stanford-trained psychiatrist, kind of decided that it might have been just a one-time psychotic break, which we were super happy to hear. Maybe our son does not have a lifelong mental illness. Maybe he just had a psychotic break. And it could have been this, could have been that, and maybe he's okay. His doctor tapered him off of olanzapine and basically went back to college in the fall, pretty much unmedicated. By October, he was in another full-blown manic psychosis. We brought him home. He was hospitalized at El Camino for 2 weeks. He was released. Every time he was released, he started smoking cigarettes again. It took me months of Googling before I finally figured out that smoking cigarettes can interfere with Zyprexa blood levels. Some say up to 80%. So every time he started smoking when he got out of the hospital, he got manic again, and then he had to go back in the hospital. And this went on. He was hospitalized that December for 2 weeks. He got out. He was hospitalized again on New Year's Eve. And then finally we decided it's not working to have him at home. Series of residential treatment programs all around the country. And the pattern was he would get better for a little while, then he would get released, then he would feel bad, then he would go off his medication, then he would get hospitalized again. It's a pattern that I know many of you in this room are familiar with. Once he was at a young adult transition program in Bend, Oregon. He was there for 10 days, and one morning, early in the morning, he left his phone and his backpack behind. He left a note saying he was going off to study Latin. He took his Latin textbooks, left them behind, and hitchhiked out of Bend, Oregon. He managed to catch 3 rides, which he's 6'4" guy, like has a big beard. I was surprised that he managed to catch 3 rides. Caught 3 rides out of Bend, Oregon. The last one was with a drunk driver. They crossed the border into California, got as far as Susanville, and were pulled over in a high-speed chase. The driver was arrested. And Matt had no money, no wallet, no phone, and so the cops gave him $10, which he used for food, till we got there to pick him up late that night. And that began another series of treatment programs. We resolved that he couldn't be living at home unless he was med compliant and sober, which he was not. And so he went to live with his grandparents in Carmel. That went okay for a couple of months, and then he got in an argument with his uncle, and he set out on foot at midnight one night in December. Spent 2 weeks roaming California, slept behind a dumpster, slept in a lifeguard tower till he stopped sleeping at all. He once recorded himself flushing his lithium down the toilet on a Greyhound bus and posted that on Snapchat. And then we were able to locate him. Dave got on a plane, flew down, rented a car, and found him at a Starbucks. He had given away most of his belongings. He'd lost 20 pounds. He was barefoot, and he was holding a shopping bag with his phone and his computer, which he had managed to hang on to for those 2 weeks. We got him hospitalized again in San Diego, and he was there 2 weeks. The fact that he had shared this journey on the internet was, of course, terrible at the time. But it turned out to be a blessing, because once he was medicated again and he came out of his psychosis, he looked at those videos and he said, "I never, ever want to be manic again. What do I need to do?" That was almost 4 years ago. And even though he started doing everything he needed to do, everything, he did not get well. He got better, but he did not get well. He meditated daily. We got him a new psychiatrist, Dr. Po Wong at Stanford, who's treating him now. He got a new therapist. He did DBT, he did CBT. He quit drinking. He quit smoking. He quit alcohol. He quit marijuana. He exercised daily. He managed his sleep. He wore blue light blocking gases, and he still was not well. I dragged him through several sessions of RTMS, the SAINT protocol at Stanford, neuromodulation protocol, which some of you may be familiar with, and which worked great for bringing him out of a brief depression, but it didn't do anything to stabilize his mood. Nothing stabilized his mood. And by now we were 5 years in, and Dr. Wong declared that he had treatment-resistant bipolar 1. And when you get a declaration of treatment-resistant mental illness, what are you supposed to do with that? You know, you're supposed to accept it, which is what everyone told me to do. And I was like, nope, not gonna go the acceptance route. Like, let's keep looking. By then, he'd been treated by 41 mental health professionals, prescribed 29 medications, 9 antipsychotics, included, plus lithium. And he was still not well. He was in college, but his cognitive function was impaired, his moods were erratic, his relationships were difficult. Every day was a struggle just to manage his own mind through the day. And then in fall of 2020, right in the heart of COVID, we got our big break. And the big break was that somebody knew somebody who knew that we were investing in mental health startups, and they connected us to Stephen Hayes, who runs a mental health startup syndicate. And he told us his story, and his story was that he met a doctor, I think it was Dr. Chris Palmer, who's in the room with us today, who helped him get on a ketogenic diet. He addressed his addiction issues, his obesity issues, and his bipolar issues. Within a year, he was able to start his own company. That night, I read Chris's website, and I read all the links from papers that many of you here in this room wrote. And I felt like, okay, we're really onto something. But for 6 years, I had been saying, we're really onto something. And I didn't want to tell Matt because I didn't want to drag him through yet another thing and have him give up yet another thing, in this case, sweets and carbohydrates and Coke, and then have it go nowhere. But now I can never keep my mouth shut. So, of course, I blurted it out next time I saw him. It's like, this guy told me about this keto diet, and it's going to make you better from bipolar, expecting him to say, yeah, Mom, as he had said with most of my dietary ideas over the last 5 years. And he said, when can I start? I want to do keto. And then it was like, okay, game on. We're going to do this thing. Reached out to Dr. Palmer. He didn't have any room in his private practice, but of course, he agreed to treat Matt pro bono just to help out. Introduced us to Denise Potter, who's also here in the room with us. We found out about Shabani Sethi's Metabolic Psychiatry clinic at Stanford, started reading everything I could read and talking to everyone, and last January 4th, Matt started on a ketogenic diet. And at first it was a little rocky. He had insomnia the first few days, which Dr. Palmer had prepared us for. Took a little extra Zyprexa, started sleeping through the night. He got COVID, he got sick, his ketones dropped, his low-level symptoms, anxiety, irritability, came roaring back. But Dr. Palmer said, and Denise said, you just got to ride it out. When you get sick, people's ketones drop. We just got to ride it out. And he wrote it out, and he never cheated on that diet. Actually, he told me he cheated once. He dipped a piece of cheese in honey. That was his big cheat. So he was completely committed, and I wouldn't be standing here today if that had not been the case. And within about a couple of months, in March, we call it March Madness, because those of you who treat bipolar patients, you know that many of them, when March hits, will become manic and be hospitalized. Dr. Wong tells us that he always plans his inpatient hours for March and September. And it had happened to Matt every year. I mean, he'd gone manic every March for year after year after year. And that March, he stayed on 5 milligrams of Zyprexa. He did not have to go up to 25, and he had 0 symptoms, not even a stitch of hypomania, and certainly no mania, and no depression to follow it. And so we really knew we were onto something by then. By May, I had been keeping a log of his symptoms and his medications for 5 years, and by May, I noticed I wasn't writing in the log because there was nothing to write, because he was just living his life. He was getting up every day, he was going to classes, he was making friends, he was making music. He was living the life we didn't know he was ever going to live, which is just a regular life with a stable mood day after day after day. And so right around that time, Carolyn Walsakata, my partner in crime, came on board with the Baszucki Group to run our foundation. And we sort of pivoted our work in science to looking at this question of metabolic psychiatry and metabolic neuroscience. And we started to talk to many of you in the room. And we started to feel like we had to devote the rest of our lives to this cause, which is really understanding mental illness as metabolic brain dysfunctions that are not lifetime sentences, that do not mean you have to be on heavy doses of medication that give you metabolic illness for the rest of your life and that make you feel bad. These can be perceived as treatable and reversible conditions. And that's why we're here today. One of the people we met along the way was Jim Abrahams from the Charlie Foundation, whose son, I'm sure those of you who are staying on will hear about the Charlie Foundation. His son was cured of pediatric epilepsy on a ketogenic diet. After, I think, 3 weeks, he stopped having seizures, and that was after failing 5 medications and surgery. And I asked him, Carolyn and I met him on a Zoom, and I asked him, so the work that you do, which is furthering science and creating grassroots movements, which in their case included a movie that Meryl Streep starred in, I said, how much of your progress has been science and how much of your progress has been grassroots movement? And he said 20% science, 80% grassroots movement. Now, they had a lot more science than we do, so let's call it 50-50. We have a job ahead of us, and I think it's about 50-50, furthering the science that drives the treatments in metabolic psychiatry, doing the metabolic neuroscience, and the second is telling the stories. I know you all in this room have a story of when you said, oh my God, we're onto something. And I hope you will share those stories with each other and maybe appear on the stage and as you go forth in the world, because it's those stories that are going to give rise to the rest of the evidence that we need to find, and those stories that are going to seed this grassroots movement that we are going to begin today in this room and carry on the work that you've all been doing, some for your entire lives, and we're going to impact millions and millions of people around the world who struggle with mental illness. So thank you all for being here.